When you think about Jesus, there probably is an image that comes to your mind. It's different for each of us, no matter who you are or what you think of Jesus. Even if you didn't grow up religious, there's a picture of him that comes to mind when you hear people discuss Jesus Christ. And today, there is no shortage of cultural images that come about when you think about Jesus or Google Jesus. But the thing is, how you visualize Jesus ultimately determines how you live your life, whether you admit it or not. What you picture about Jesus dictates how you go about your life. So, for example, to prove my point, if you think of Jesus like in Talladega Nights, where he's in a tuxedo t-shirt, and he's formal, but he's here to party, that kind of indicates how you're going to live your life, kind of how you think God thinks about you and what you do. If you picture Jesus like hippie Jesus, someone brought up, is this AI because he has a third arm? I don't know. I Googled it. But if this is how you picture Christ, you kind of picture him like a self-love guru of discovery and introspection, and that's going to define how you think about faith. If you follow America Jesus, it's going to frame how you do things. It's going to frame your whole theology. NASA somehow involved. And if you think of Jesus like this, as just like this old thing, maybe he's antiquated. He was good back then, but not really helpful for me in my modern problems. If you picture Jesus like this, it's going to determine how you conduct yourself in any spiritual journey that you're a part of. How we view Jesus really does influence how we live our lives. And arguably, nowhere is this more true than when it comes to how we picture Jesus and what we think he thinks about sex. Our sexuality is arguably the most personal and visceral thing about us. So naturally, what we think he thinks about all that makes a big difference on what we run after and what we define as good or bad or flourishing, restricting or freeing. Now, more than ever, there are competing narratives around what Jesus was like, what he was for, what he was against, what he did or didn't say. And because of all that, we need to look back at the original church, the OG church, and look at how did those who heard him talk about sex conduct themselves when it comes to their sexual lives. So today, as we continue the series and look at first century Christians and how they lived, I want to ask, what did Jesus actually teach about sex? How did the church live amidst the sexual climate of its day? And what does that mean for us who are following Jesus? And what does that mean for those of us who are just on the outskirts kind of investigating, figuring out if we want to follow him at all? See, one of my big burdens as a pastor is to help you know Christ and experience the life he offers. But I also have an equally significant burden of making sure you don't follow a counterfeit Jesus that leads to false assurances and misguided wisdom. So today we'll look at what does Jesus have to say about sex? How is the church called to embody those teachings? And what if Jesus' vision of sex is actually not a repressed, diminished look at our sexuality, but an elevated look that produces more freedom and healing than the secular or progressive visions that we see out in the world when it comes to this area? In my research, I learned a lot from a pastor in New York City named John Tyson. I try to go up there a couple times a year and connect with this community and learn from him. And he introduced me to the work of this guy named John Ince, who's not a Christian, but he's a really important voice as we begin this conversation. Ince wrote a book, it took him about 20 years to write, called The Politics of Lust. And he was one of the early founders of the sex positive movement, but in his book, The Politics of Lust, he basically landed on this idea that erotophobia is the root cause of all of our sexual problems. Erotophobia means a fear of sexual desire. So he said that the Bible's take on lust and sex made people hate women or demonize themselves, and that's what was causing shame and brokenness today. And his argument was that the good life occurs when we remove sexual restraint. He said the fear of desire caused all these problems, so we need to get rid of any sexual restraints that exist. And he said we need to free people from fear-based sexual oppression so they can experience legitimate pleasure and make everything better for everybody. So he wrote that in the early 2000s. And what's interesting is Ince's hypothesis on what produces good things has basically been the life script of the average American for the last 25 years. You know, everything he just said of like, let's get rid of fear-based sexual expression so that people can be free, that's pretty much the play we've been running for 2 generations. And we live in a day and age now where the things that are normal for us when it comes to sex were unrecognizable for people 2 generations ago. You can do you however you want now. You can sleep with almost anyone you want. Porn is completely normal. They actually have porn literacy classes in some public school districts throughout our country. Images that were scandalous 20 years ago, now, like we don't even bat an eye at, And the sexual boundaries that used to be very, standard are now, not really in existence at all. So, having lived this experiment, basically, when it comes to sexual expression, having embraced the philosophy of John Insay and others in the sex-positive movement, and having done it for about 25 years, here's my question. How are we doing? Like, how are we doing? Are we better? Are we more comfortable in our bodies? Or are we doing better with intimacy or worse? See, the quality of an idea isn't discovered until that idea is tested. A philosophy, you can't tell if it's good or bad until the philosophy is applied. So communism, for example, began in European colleges where philosophers were strategizing about how to create the perfect human society. It sounded good on paper, and then its application produced the deadliest century in U.S. and world history. Its application is what exposed it as being flawed and immoral. Same is true when it comes to bad theology. Sometimes you'll hear things that, man, that sounds good. But if its application flies in the face of Scripture, that's how you know it's heresy. So, with this philosophy idea, about unlimited sexual expression, and that's really what's been burdening us. We need to get rid of fear-based sexual expression in order to live a really great society and have a great sexual life. Having run that play, my question is, how are we doing? To answer that, I want to read some excerpts from one of the best books I've read in the last few years called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. This will be mandatory reading for my daughters specifically when they get into middle school and high school. The language is intense, I'll give you that caveat, but I still highly recommend it. And it's written by Louise Perry. She is a feminist atheist with no ties to Christianity who spent years analyzing the sociological data to see if all this sexual freedom was producing any good. And to answer the question, how we doing, I want to read to you some of my favorite quotes from her book. How we doing? Put simply, the porn generation is having less sex, and the sex they are having is also worse, less intimate, less satisfying, and less meaningful. She said, hookup culture demands that women suppress their natural instincts in order to match male sexuality, and thus meet the male demand for no-strings sex. It's a solution for the sexuality mismatch that benefits some men at the expense of most women. She said a quick browse of any online polyamorous forum will uncover a lot of people who are trying very hard to practice ethical non-monogamy and yet are tormented by sexual jealousy. And she said women are still expected to please men and make it look effortless. But while in the 1950s, the angel of the house hid her apron, the modern take is an angel of the bedroom who is furiously working to maintain her image to perfection. She pretends to orgasm. She pretends to like anal sex. She pretends not to mind when the friends with benefits arrangement causes her pain. We have smoothly transitioned from one form of feminine subservience to another, but we pretend that this one is liberation. Listen, 26% of all men on erectile dysfunctional medication today are under the age of 40. There's a new medical phenomenon called death grip syndrome because so many young men masturbate with such frequency and intensity they can no longer be aroused by a human partner. So how are we doing? Not great. Now hear me, I am not here on some evangelical high horse giving lectures to bad people about how to improve their behavior. The church at large doesn't look any better than the vision we get in the world. We've seen sexual abuse cover-ups and affairs and divorce in the church is the same as it is outside. The church hasn't looked that much better. So I know that. Also, I know that we all have sexual sin. Like, we all know the damaging effects of what's been done to us or what we've done to ourselves or what we've done to other people. Me too. So I know whenever we talk about this, there's a lot of pain in the room. But despite all that, one of the critical purposes of the church is to tell the truth about lies. We have to tell the truth about the lies we believe and the lies we live. And more importantly, elevate the better story of Jesus that he invites us into. And by God's good, brilliant grace, that includes a better story about our sexual lives and sexual fulfillment and sexual freedom. See, the secular worldview demotes sex to mean nothing more than like a biological act. It's eating and breathing. But when you look to Jesus in the Bible, you don't see a repressed, diminished view of sex like that. We see an elevated view of sex, where it's something incredible to be pursued and maintained and protected. The world says sex is swapping of fluids. Jesus says it's a mingling of souls. So you tell me which group has a higher view of what God created us for. The Bible teaches sex isn't something that you do to a person, it's something you do with a person. It's the pinnacle of physical and emotional and spiritual connection to be experienced through the safety of commitment, aka marriage, where it is shame-free, and it's so deeply profound that when done, it produces life itself. That is the biblical view of sex. Yet in our time, all emotion and intimacy has been stripped. It's nothing more than a performance. And now we're living in a world where for several generations we've been playing with fire, and everyone's wondering, how did we get burned? To be clear, this is not a male sermon. Obviously, guys struggle with this very significantly, but studies show 1/3 of all U.S. women are entangled in a relationship with pornography, and even more are casually consuming smut novels and pretending it doesn't affect them. So this is not just for the fellas. Ladies, you're in this too. But my heart for today is to tell the truth about lies and tell the better story that we see about sex found in the teachings of Jesus and the scriptures, so we can uncover something that leads to freedom and shows a watching world the beauty and the power and the weight of this amazing thing that God gave us. Now, along the way, there's a couple questions you might have, like, why should we even look at the Bible to answer this? How can something written 2,000 years ago and more, how can the teachings of a guy 2,000 years ago help me in my modern problems with sex? Well, one of the brilliant things about the Bible is that it was written in a context, the New Testament was written in a context that was nearly identical to the sexual climate we live with today. Okay, here's a snapshot of the sexual practices in the first century in ancient Rome. Okay, divorce, super common now, super common then. In fact, it was actually worse for women because they weren't allowed to initiate divorce. Only men could. So it damaged women and children specifically, and it was rampant all over the place. Adultery, super prominent. In fact, if you got into a relationship, the expectation is that you would get cheated on in the ancient world. Today we have OnlyFans, obviously, but in ancient Rome, there were temple priestesses who made their living by having sex with men at the temple, and they called it worship. Sex was largely a power play, so it benefited a very small minority of top-tier men while wreaking havoc on most women and children. Sex with underage kids was commonplace, especially among the male elites. Polygamy, polyamorous relationships, polygyny, all of that was super common. Men loved collecting women and kind of keeping them off to the side to do different jobs for them while boosting their ego by bragging about how many female partners they had. I'm sure we know nothing about that. And then back then, in the first century, as the church was taking root, as Jesus was walking the earth, homosexuality and same-sex humans were common. 13 of the first 14 Roman emperors were in bisexual or exclusively homosexual relationships. And when the early church exploded in the first century, you know who was Caesar? This guy named Nero, who was the first Caesar to actually marry a guy. He actually did it twice. Now, I share that so you know when people on TikTok say Jesus never knew about monogamous same-sex relationships or he never spoke against it, that's just not true. One, it existed in his time and he knew about it. Two, he's the all-knowing Son of God who isn't surprised by how the human heart strays. And three, and it was in this sexual climate you heard me just articulate that he said God's will for sex is in the covenant of marriage between one man and one woman. And it's because of all this stuff that the OG church was a counterculture when it came to their sexual ethic. The church embodied a counter vision of fidelity and safety and commitment in a world of absolute sexual chaos you just heard me talk about. Here's what one second-century writer said as he observed the church in ancient Rome. He said, Christians marry, as do all others. They have a common table, but not a common bed. They are in the flesh, but they do not live after the flesh. And the reason they did this is because of what Jesus himself taught. In his most famous message he ever gave, called the Sermon on the Mount, he stood on a hill and Jesus told the truth about lies. He used this phrase over and over again. You have heard the commandment that says, and then he'd say something everybody thought was true, and then he'd say, but I say, and he would subvert what was universally accepted as the best idea. And after hitting on a bunch of cultural issues in the Sermon on the Mount, he says this about sex. You have heard the commandment that says you must not commit adultery. But I say anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, a few things here. One, this word lust is a word that meant to desire or deeply crave something that goes against God's will. And in this phrase, anyone who even looks, is the Greek word blepo, which means a continuous process of looking and gazing. So the looking that Jesus is talking about is not like an incidental glance, it is an intentional gaze for the purpose of enjoying what you're looking at. And it's actually the same word in the Bible when the disciples see Jesus after the resurrection. It says they blepoed him. They looked and saw and gazed to be with him. So the look and gaze is not bad, but when it's tied into lust and sexual desire, that's what Jesus is saying is the problem. So think about this real quick, okay? In a world where people were arguing about which sex acts count as good or bad, you know, what really counts as cheating or not. I'm sure no one's had those conversations. What really counts? What's on the table? What's not on the table? And all of that, Jesus says, yeah, looking and lusting after anyone not your spouse is the same as infidelity and adultery to God. Which means for us in 2024, checking out that girl at the gym and getting a look over and over and over again, that's off the table according to Jesus. It means ogling over that dude on your phone, that's off the table according to Jesus. Fantasizing about a character in one of your ACOTAR books, yeah, ladies, I know about those. Fantasizing about one of those characters and getting yourself sexually revved up, Jesus says is off the table because you are lusting and longing for a sexual encounter, even in your mind, for someone that you are not married to. And Jesus says all that is as serious as when we physically sleep with someone. And the reason he says that is because of what it does to your heart. Now, I know that sounds extreme, but I want to help you see Jesus is drawing the lines for your good so far away from the cliff that you don't ruin everything when you start playing with fire. And he talked with this kind of intensity every time he mentioned sexual sin. Here's another time. He said, if your eye, even your good eye, causes you to lust, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. It's intense. He's constantly telling people to wake up and watch out for what happens to us when it comes to sexual sin. To him, it was no small thing. I mean, it was a mingling of souls. We see this in Matthew 19. He says, from the beginning, God made them male and female. And he said, this explains why a man leaves his mother and father and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two, but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. So this was the theme of Jesus when it comes to sex, meaning in a world of infidelity, exploitation, and the impulsive pursuit of pleasure at all costs, Jesus says the good life and the better story of God is seeing sex as weighty, beautiful, meaningful, and precious to be experienced between a man and a woman who have agreed to sacrificial love for life called marriage. Now, I know some of you are like, what's the big fuss? Like, if she's cool with it and I'm cool with it and no one gets hurt, why do you care? Why should I let a rabbi from Nazareth 2,000 years ago tell me what I can and can't do with my body? I got this from John Tyson, but here's why Jesus pushes this so much. 3 reasons. Number 1, lust distorts human relationships. Your sexual sin distorts your relationships with other people. I'm going to tell you something no one told me before I got married that I wish they had. When you get married as a man, your lust does not go down, it goes up. Especially if you've done things God's way. When I got married, my thought life and how I looked at women and lusted after them did not get easier after I started having sex with my wife. Frequently, I might add. That's your one joke today, okay? We're going in today. What's your one joke? But after I started having sex with my wife, because she and I, we had crossed some boundaries we set for ourselves, but never actually had sex. But when I started having sex, looking at other women got more difficult because now I knew what it felt like. I could visualize it. I could fantasize about it. I knew how great it was, which made lusting after others easier. And I went through a season for months after we got married where my view of women was distorted because no one prepared me for what happens to your brain when you are being intimate with someone. So let this be a reminder, getting married doesn't solve your sexual problems. It exposes them. Where you have not yet trusted God and seen him mature in you, that's only going to get worse. But now you have somebody else who's going to deal with the shrapnel. So deal with that. We'll talk about that in a bit. But lust is a big deal to God because it shapes how you look at other people. Secondly, lust is a big deal to Jesus because it normalizes sin in general. Here's what makes our fight for purity difficult, okay? You know what happens after you look at porn? You know what happens after you go too far sexually with someone you're not married to? You know what happens? Nothing. There's no bolt of lightning. There's no fresh revelation. You feel guilty for a while. You feel bad, but then by brunch the next day, you're like, I don't feel so bad, And then that's why we fall back into it. But Jesus cautioned us. He raised the stakes so much because he wanted us to see, even though it feels like nothing is happening, so much is being done to us and in us. It's why the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 6, run from sexual sin. Don't try to fight. Don't try to fight. I'm really going to overcome my struggle by being home in my apartment with my laptop by myself all night. I'm going to win. No, loser. You're going to lose. I've tried it. Run from sexual sin. No other sin so clearly affects the body as this one does. For sexual immorality is a sin against your own body. When we fall into sexual sin and don't view it with the intensity of Jesus, we die a slow death, rooted in selfishness and perpetuated by our own apathy. Eugene Peterson said in his paraphrasing of James 1, we have no one to blame but the leering, seducing flare-up of our own lust. Lust gets pregnant and has a baby, sin. Sin grows up to adulthood and becomes a real killer. Lust normalizes sin and it leads to ruin. So hear me, a casual posture towards lust today leads to catastrophe tomorrow. If you are casual about a struggle with lust in your life today, it will wreak havoc on your life tomorrow. Jesus says you cannot be lazy about lust or it will lead to ruin. And one of the big reasons he hits it so hard is because of ultimately what lust does to human societies, because lust dehumanizes people. Do you know why exotic dancers have stage names? Because it's really hard to objectify somebody when you know who they really are. It's easier to lust after someone named Trixie or Bunny than it is to stare at a Samantha or an Emily. One pastor wrote about this and he said, if you want to clear out a strip club real easily, before you call out the girl, say, hey, get ready to meet sultry Susan. But before she comes out, just know her name's Mary Walensky. She's got 4 siblings. She never met her dad. She's got 1 kid. She's struggling to get by, but she loves dogs and wants to become a dental hygienist. He said, that'll clear out the room real quick. And he's right. And he ends by saying, an introduction like that would short-circuit lust because it would put intimacy and humanity back into the picture. Unrestricted sexual expression does not bring connection. It brings objectification. Because lust is the service of me at the expense of you. It dehumanizes people. It turns objects or people into objects instead of image bearers of God. And it is why some of the most popular pornography in the world includes rape, violence, and degrading acts. And you want to know why they make it? Because there's a market for it. Because this is where the sexual revolution has brought us. You get rid of all restraint when it comes to sex, you get people, women, who now have podcasts who all they do is talk about how they regret going into porn. But at the time, they were empowered. And now it's the biggest regret of their life. And here's why I bring all this up. Here's why I'm going in so much today. The line Jesus sets when it comes to sexual sin is not extreme, it's appropriate. We are the ones who've misunderstood the significance of what sex is. We're the ones who diminish the incredible gift that it is from God. In another book on the damaging effects of the sexual revolution, one college student was talking to her therapist about the struggle she was facing, and she said, why, doctor, to her therapist, why, doctor, do they tell you how to protect your body from herpes and pregnancy, but they don't tell you what sex does to your heart? Jesus in the early church embraced this reality about sex. And because sex is a big deal, lust is not to be trifled with. And anything that flies counter to God's design does not lead to health, it leads to harm. Sin is not just doing bad things, it's missing the mark of the flourishing that God created you to experience. And it's why the OG church was a counterculture of sexuality and their sexual ethic, because they believed sex is good. It's designed by God. It's a gift for us to be experienced, but it's to be experienced between a man and a woman who enter into the covenant of marriage, who have a lifelong promise that I am here for good. And in that context, sex is to be expressed, explored, and exciting, baby. That's the biblical view of sex. It's not erotophobia where we're afraid of desire. It's taking that fire and putting it in the fireplace so nobody gets burned. And that's the better story that Jesus leads us into. A life of sexual fulfillment and freedom and shame-free connection with the person you love instead of disappointment, fear, and humiliation that we see today. That's why the late Tim Keller said, the Christian sex ethic was revolutionary. It introduced the very idea of consent in sex, and it made sex not about self-fulfillment, which always privileges those with more power, but about creating lasting community that reflects God's relationship to us. That is a higher, not lower, view of sex. Now, I know it's a lot of information, and I know it's a lot of what not to do, but that's because that's how Jesus taught on this. He spent a lot of time on, hey, don't do this, stop this. But I do want to end by getting practical about what this means for us corporately as a church and what this means for you if you're seeking to experience the better story that Jesus invites you into when it comes to sex. So here are two applications I'd encourage you to write down that affect us corporately first. Number one, we aim to bring healing to the wounded. Our goal is to make disciples and seek and save the lost, to point to the grace and truth of Jesus in every corner of the world that we can. But similar to the first century church, before people come to trust Christ with their eternity, they're going to see if they can trust the church with their pain. And it's why we aim to bring healing and wholeness to a sexually broken world. If you call Mosaic home, and you have been forgiven of sin, and you're seeing God redeem and renew and restore the broken things in your life, you need to hear me on this. You are a triage nurse in the sexual sin department. All of us who call Mosaic home, who are running after Jesus, we are triage nurses in the sexual sin unit. And we're not the great physician. Jesus is. But every week, people roll up in here wounded by the sexual ethic of modern society. And we get to be a place filled with broken people who've got just as much baggage too, but we've been healed by the great physician, and we partner in his triage work and guide people into the loving care of Jesus Christ. And I know I'm not that old, but I've been doing pastoring for about 20 years, paid and unpaid. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of prejudice and violence and injustice and bitterness and rage that's out there in the world, but nothing does damage to people like sexual sin. Every week, someone walks in here because their marriage is hanging by a thread. Every week, someone comes in here because there was a discovery or a confession of spousal betrayal, and they can't see straight, and this is their one shot to not end it. Every week, someone comes in here, and they can't bring themselves to look at our screens during worship because of what they were looking on their screens the night before or the person they were with the week of. We've sat with hundreds of young adults who are just not processing what their parents' divorce did to them. We've sat with dozens of young women who are with good Christian men, but they can't seem to be alone with them because of the violent pornography they watched in high school. Jesus said it's better to gouge out your eye than have your whole body be thrown into hell. And as a pastor, and I've sat in those rooms and I've been through my own stuff, I know what that hell is like. It's real. Nothing hurts the human heart like the shrapnel of sexual sin that fillets the souls of those who are involved. I've seen how the shrapnel of sexual sin really messes with people. And that's why we have to be a place that brings healing to the wounded. Nothing messes up your life like sexual sin. Nothing discredits the church like sexual sin. Nothing puts shame on your heart that Jesus died to conquer quite like sexual sin. And so we have to be a place where they know, yeah, I did that. Yeah, that was done to me, but that doesn't define me because of what Jesus has done for me. The good news is that God does not leave us in our mess, that we don't have to live in shame. Now, because of him, what's been done doesn't define. 2 Corinthians 5 says, if anyone is in Christ, he or she is a new creation. The old has gone and the new has come. And it's because of that truth we aim to bring healing to the wounded, and from that place we aim to display holiness to the world. Our ability to do this is massively shaped by our willingness to do this. in her great book, Game Changer for me, called Love Thy Body by Nancy Pearcey. She said, what Christians do with their sexuality is one of the most important testimonies they give to the surrounding world. How we live different from the world in this area speaks louder and more clear that we are serious about Christ and his saving power than any other area of life. And it's why, as we seek to bring healing to the wounded, we have a burden to display holiness in our world and point people to the better story that we are actively living in and partnering with God while we screw up along the way. And it's why, as we seek to do this, we aim to be a church where sex is exclusively, this is a statement about us, what we run after according to Jesus. We're a church where sex is exclusively for a man and a woman in the safety of the covenant of marriage. We seek to display holiness in the world by adhering to this. The first century church in a world of unlimited sexual expression held to this, that sex was to be experienced between one biological man and one biological female in the covenant of marriage, a lifelong commitment of fidelity and sacrificial love, period. That's what they did. No one would have written about it in Rome saying how unusual they were if they just did what everybody else did. But they didn't. Meaning anything that strays from this is off the table if you choose to follow Jesus. Oral, anal, whatever stuff gets you excited, if it's not channeled toward a spouse that you are called into in sacrificial love and covenant, it's off the table for you. And it's a chance to rely on Jesus for greater formation so that the fire stays in the fireplace. Now, some people would say, oh, this is super outdated. But what's fascinating is that even the most ardent feminists and progressives are now publishing articles and books about how monogamy relationships is what's best for all of society. Remember that feminist atheist I read a little bit earlier? Here's how she ends her book on the case against the sexual revolution. She says, while the monogamous marriage model may be relatively unusual, it is also spectacularly successful. When monogamy is imposed on a society, it tends to become richer and has lower rates of both child abuse and domestic violence. I have one piece of advice to offer in this final chapter. Get married and do your best to stay married. Critics of marriage are right to say it has been used as a vehicle for the control of women. Where critics go wrong is in arguing there is any better system. She has nothing to gain to point to the ethic of Jesus. Nothing to gain. But she says, this is what's best. Our world is coming around to the fact that God knows best about sex because he created it. And church, if we just got this right, our witness could be so much stronger to the wounded world. Another thing we're called to as a church is to have marriage be viewed as a covenant, not a contract. I could do 35 minutes on this, but I won't. I did a whole sermon on marriage and divorce in 2022. You could YouTube my name, Jonathan Mosaic, divorce. You'll see it. 2022, it's right up there. But long story short, marriage in the church should be a stark contrast to the flakiness and fickleness of the world, but so often it's not. So we're called to display holiness and sacrificial love with great intensity because of what Jesus taught. But also we're called to be a place where personal purity is a big priority. These are kind of corporate things, but this is for you as an individual. Nothing will block you from spiritual growth. Nothing will prevent you from experiencing shame-free faith like being apathetic in the areas of your sexual sin. 1 John 1:6 says we are lying if we say we have fellowship with God but go on living in spiritual darkness. We are not practicing the truth. This doesn't mean actively struggling and working and growing. This means pretending it's not a problem, is what 1 John is talking about. For anyone who's trusted Christ, there are endless second chances because of the grace of God. You're not defined by your sin, but by the righteousness of Jesus. But sometimes, because of grace, we get apathetic towards our sin. So please hear me. Let today be the day where if you struggle with porn, or you have an OnlyFans account, or you can't stop masturbating, or you need smut novels to get you in the mood so you can have sex with your spouse, I say this with love and understanding as someone who wrestled with pornography for 16 years. If you have an ongoing sexual sin that you have grown apathetic towards, it's time to deal with it. It's time to admit to yourself you can't be trusted with the internet on your phone, and that's okay. It's time to admit that you can't have unguarded access to social media. It's time to admit that you aren't mature enough to bring your laptop home from work alone and hang out all night. That's okay to admit. What's wrong is to pretend it's not a big deal and to continue living in shame. Get an app that helps you fight against lust and pornography. Covenant Eyes, the Fortify app. You could Google one, you'll find a ton. Get in a group this summer. Get real with people about your marriage struggles or your personal struggles. I talked to a guy last service who's never had friends he could talk to about overcoming pornography. He's going to get in a group this summer. Confess to a friend today the thing that's been growing mold in the dark. Scripture says confession and shame do not exist together. Confession is the light that brings death to what hides in the dark. And did you know Christian sex therapists are a thing? You can find one. Talk about the deep ache that you carry from something that was done to you or a mistake that you made that's infecting your personal identity with Jesus Christ. You can pursue all these things. But we're called to embody personal purity. And when we do, we tell the better story of God and his redeeming and restoring work in ways that almost nothing else can. I want to end by telling you a story that I bet most of you are going to think I made up. But they're real people. I've got the quotes to prove it, and you'll get it in a little bit. But I want to tell you the story of a couple named Julie and Giovanni. Months ago, Julie checked the baptism box at Mosaic. And whenever that happens, we do a one-on-one call to kind of hear about how they're doing. We hear their story. We hear about their struggles. We hear about what are the big things in life that are going to be hard for them to trust Jesus with and all that stuff. And so in that call, Julie told us that her and her boyfriend Giovanni were sleeping together. And as is normal for our leaders, we have to then call her out on that and say, well, Jesus teaches this, and if you want Jesus to be your Savior and Lord, you're going to have to subscribe to what he says about sex. Are you willing to do that? And after that call, she was not interested in that. And she told us, quote, I was mad. I left that conversation broken and hurt and struggled to work through it. I struggled with it for weeks. But she told her boyfriend Giovanni about it, who did not check the baptism box. He was not interested in following Jesus just yet. But he decided to talk to a coworker, a Christian coworker, about it all. And his Christian coworker said, I think you should give it a shot. So Giovanni, the boyfriend, who did not check the box, initiated, how about we try this abstinence thing and just see what happens? So this young couple in 2024 decided to stop having sex because Jesus says so. I heard that story Thursday, and we reached out to say, hey, what's that been like for you for months? I want to read to you what she wrote back. She said, so many women feel like they need to have sex with their man to keep him happy. And talking to God those initial weeks about my insecurity and hurt surrounding giving up sex, I discovered that what I really craved wasn't the physical aspect, it was quality time. The feeling of being present and having each other's full attention. Once God showed me that that is what intimacy is, Giovanni and I began spending more time reading the Bible together, praying together, and spending time together without our phones. That's where God showed me that intimacy with your boyfriend is best experienced with God as a part of it. A few months later, we got engaged, and since living in obedience to Jesus, we feel closer than we ever have. And we said, hey, are you cool with us sharing this? This seems like a lot. And she said, quote, absolutely. I want to talk about it. People need to know that this works and is worth doing. And then she went on later, I wouldn't have done this if I wasn't trying to follow Jesus. It was not natural for me. Me too. Listen, I want you to know next week, Julie's getting baptized, and her boyfriend Giovanni, who's now her fiance, who was not interested when they began this, he too will be in the tub because he's ready to give his life to Jesus next week. Crazy. Crazy. I told you wouldn't believe it. We didn't pay him anything, I promise. That's not how we do things. Listen, I'm not interested in behavior modification, and neither is God. Doing all the right things with the wrong heart does nothing for you with Jesus. He wants your whole self. And he knows he cannot have your whole self if you keep your sex off to the side. You've got to trust him around everything that you are, at your most personal and visceral point. Because it is when you do that the deepest source of your shame becomes the point of God's greatest work of restoration and redemption in your heart. We are triage nurses in the sexual sin unit. And to see God move in the life of Julie and Giovanni is just one example of hundreds in our church where people are saying yes to the truth of Jesus and rejecting the lies of the world. And if you've never made a decision to go all in with Christ and say, yeah, I'm going to put down what I think is best and submit to your subscription of human flourishing, I choose to do that. If you're ready to put your faith in him, knowing that you will screw up, but that there are endless second chances, I want you to check the baptism box on your connection card. We'll call you this week. We'll have a talk. And we'll give you homework if you're not quite ready. We lovingly guide you. We don't condemn you and seek to judge you. But let us do that. Check the baptism box today so we could talk to you. But God's after your heart. And that means all of you. And there is no greater area of life that we as individuals can embody our hope and allegiance to Jesus than picking up the burden of pursuing purity in a world of sexual chaos. I know it's intense. I know some of you might be feeling a weight on you. That's not shame. God doesn't put that on you, but that's what we call at Mosaic good guilt. The call to go higher, to trust Jesus deeper, and see him renew you in ways that you thought weren't available. Let's pray and we'll continue. God, I pray for the man and woman who incorrectly believe that you hate them, that you condemn them, and that you think what they did is just a little too much for his grace. God, I pray against lies that we're believing right now about ourselves because of what we did yesterday. And God, that's not to minimize grace, but it's to elevate the great cost of what you did for us. That no matter what we've done, we can be a new creation in you. That grace is available through faith because of what you did, Jesus. God, remind us of that in this moment. That while we are lowly sinners, you call us to be sons and daughters through faith. God, help the person who feels like they can't pick up their head right now. Know that you see them and you love them, you're for them, and you offer a path towards redemption and restoration in your Son. Jesus, help us. In your name I pray. Amen.